Recording in progress.
Yep. That's okay. They missed the first sentence. So knowing that he was a bit frightened, potentially, of the storm, it got me thinking about things that I was told or I thought when I was a kid about storms, about thunder. You might have heard some of these. Thunder is the sound of angels bowling, or thunder is the sound of God snoring. I don't know who told me this, and I'm not sure, but I think I understood at the time, even when I was little, that I wasn't participating in a science lesson, but rather people were trying to reassure me. And I did feel reassured. What silly things did people tell you when you were a child? I bet we could come up with a long list. There's storks and babies. If you make a face like this, it'll stay like that. Or if you swallow a watermelon seed, a plant will grow in your stomach. There's a second kind of list too, sometimes believed by the adults who were telling us things, and sometimes not. An omnipresent and beloved parent who watches over us. There's others. As children, we tend to believe the things that adults tell us, especially if we think that the adult believes them too. Over time, as we see more of the world, talk to more people, hear more ideas, learn something about hypothesis and science, we begin to modify our thinking. I know that when I was a child, I believed wholeheartedly and completely in the stories I learned in Sunday school. I pored over the activity sheets and coloring pages that were designed to teach me some of the core stories of Hebrew and Christian scriptures. I was an earnest child who spent a fair number of childhood hours looking for evidence that the things I was being told were true. I longed to see divine visions. I so hoped that explorers might chance upon the gates of the Garden of Eden. I wasn't very old, though, when I found some puzzling gaps in the logic. If all the boy babies were killed, as the story goes around Jesus' birth, how could there possibly have been disciples? I heard a clergy person once talking about original sin. I was about 12, and every fiber of my body found the notion of babies being born with sin completely unbelievable. And so it was about that time that I decided I was done with religion. If there was any flaw in the logic, I felt duty-bound to reject the whole lot of it, and I did. But I continued to have an intellectual curiosity about religion during the next years. As someone who really liked studying history, I knew that a knowledge of a culture's religion could provide valuable insights into their worldview and something about who they were. For many years, that's where my relationship with religion resided. Religion and other mythical tales, I concluded, were like windows that provided views and insights. However, after high school, my studies included the previously mentioned history and also English literature. Now, if you don't already know this, there is nothing quite like the study of Victorian poetry to disavow of the notion that literal interpretations are the only kind of interpretation. Let's just say that those Victorians were far more interested in human sexuality than I'd previously thought they were. Allegory, parable, and metaphor became central to my way of thinking about most of what I read. I imagine my journey isn't unlike some of yours. As a child, I had a literal understanding. I became a skeptic as I aged. And then in time, I kind of circled back around and became more open to considering the understandings and insight that religion might offer us. I was still quite skeptical. I remember, you learned that I've become a Unitarian since '83. I remember sitting uncomfortably at the First Unitarian Church of Hamilton with 2 small children with me. I'd become a member, and I remember feeling profoundly uncomfortable and squirming a bit when someone referenced God. Pshaw, I thought. That concept is an intellectual curiosity, not something that's relevant to my daily life. But in time, after conversations with people I respected, I found my thinking shifting a bit more. Remember the list I started earlier? Sometimes the people telling the stories believe them and sometimes they don't? An omnipresent parent who watches over us? What are we to make of those stories now? Joseph Campbell, a late scholar of comparative mythology, asked about many of the stories he studied. He said there were two questions to ask. Is it factual? Most of them, he said, the answer was no. But then the next question, is it true? And the answer is sometimes yes. Fact and true aren't the same thing. Maybe some of the stories fall into that category. Let's look at a few of them. Maybe the Adam and Eve story reminds us that we, despite our differences, all really come from the same place. Noah's Ark, perhaps, is a story about new beginnings and promises to make different choices. There are Buddhist stories about lotus flowers growing where Buddha stepped. Lotus flowers root in the muddy bottom of water and are held above it. Maybe there's a lesson in there for those of us who might like to forget some of our muddy beginnings. The literature, scriptures, and folk tales of the world are full of such stories. We might believe some of them, and some we might not. That's okay. But what's not okay in my mind is to too quickly dismiss someone else's literal or symbolic understanding, rather than rush, as I used to dismiss someone's story because it didn't happen, or didn't happen the way it was told, or might not have happened. Instead of dismissing it, I believe we might most usefully find a way to sit with those stories. Instead of rejecting something, why not ask, what is the truth in this? Or what can this teach me? Or how can this help me expand my understanding and my compassion? What would it mean if we focused more on being curious than on being clever? Or more sympathetic than strident? We UUs like to think of ourselves justifiably as discerning people. The path of unexamined understanding is not ours. We assert that we value a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. However, we sometimes cling to the picture of ourselves as rigorously discriminating at the expense of some larger truths. And when we do that, we sometimes hurt other people, and we sometimes hurt the communities and congregations we love. To be confident in your opinion is laudable, but not if it means, in my estimation, dismissing other people outright. I have seen in my work congregations fall apart. It makes me sad. I've seen people, conscientious and justice-minded people, insist that their way of doing things, their set of acceptable words, their set of appropriate practices were the right way. I remember hearing years ago in Hamilton someone mockingly dismissing a piece of music that had been included in a service, a piece of music that had been written after 1990 and had been written and performed by a woman, and it was dismissed by this person as, well, not very Unitarian. Sometimes when people assert their theological or liturgical choices as the right ones, other people have been made to feel as if they don't belong. Successful navigation of differences requires deep generosity and a lively curiosity. Maybe you squirm, as I used to, when you hear the word God. Maybe there are songs that remind you too much of the church of your childhood. Maybe you'd be pleased if you never heard another reference to religion or religious texts. However, if we are generous and curious, we'll challenge ourselves to remember that the thing that makes our religious allergies flare up might be exactly the thing that is a healing salve for someone else. Maybe the phrase makes us roll our eyes, but maybe it's the phrase that makes someone else feel welcome. At our best, I believe our communities are ones where people can say to those that make choices that are different than our own, tell me about the way that story, or that theological understanding, or that song, or that particular worship format are important to you. When we can shake our binary right-wrong thinking, new possibilities for our communities begin to emerge. We don't really need evidence in this world, do we, of how wrong things can go when people are so very sure of their opinions and choices. Just this week, we heard the news that graves had been identified at the site of a former residential school in Kenora. Certainly, the people who made those decisions to remove children from their homes were sure that their decision to de-indigenize children was the right thing to do. I believe that they thought they were doing the right thing. Their choices, though, were born of a sense of superiority and rightness, not of curiosity, not of openness. And since September 7th, when the Israeli-Hamas conflict began, Toronto police have reported a sharp increase in anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim incidents. I know that there are a wide variety of opinions regarding the choices and actions of both groups affected by that conflict. There are strong feelings. But someone has to be very sure of the rightness of their opinion to threaten a doctor in Toronto or a family in London. I do believe, though those are extreme examples, and I like to think we're not going to be quite so extreme in our thinking, but I believe we need to be careful. Years ago, I heard a saying attributed to a North American Aboriginal group that went something like, "Don't spank a child in case you kill them." Seems a bit much to get from here to there. But I think there's some wisdom in that teaching if in fact it's true. There's wisdom even if it's not true. It might be true, not real. But I'm not sure it's important because I hear a lesson in it. Most of the choices we make in relationship fall somewhere on a continuum between kind or cruel or right or wrong or safe or unsafe. And when we give ourselves permission to move along that line, away from our values and our ideals and our openness, we've given ourselves permission to center our own preferences over that of another. And when we do that, I believe we do ourselves a grave disservice. I have mentioned that there was a period after I became a UU when God talk made me uncomfortable. This one always makes me laugh. I used to wonder what the value of ministers were. Why would we ever need one of those, I thought. Oh, well, there you go. Because UUism very clearly defined that we were a community with the priesthood and the prophethood of all. We didn't need leaders to help us with it. There were more than a few years when I spent far more time thinking about what I was rejecting rather than how I was learning and how I was helping to grow a community. And building a community is what I have come to believe is the most important thing we do. In a world where hurtful binary thinking is so prevalent, I believe we can build communities where we remain open and loving, even with those who don't see things the same way that we do. And I know that you don't need me to tell you all of this. You've already thought of it. Your website says that you are a community of spiritual explorers and that you value the insights of science as much as that of ancient wisdom, reason, and compassion. That sort of says it, doesn't it? And even though you've said this, even though you've said that's the kind of community you want to be, the kind of community you want to create, sometimes you won't. Because we're human. Of course we'll disagree. We will get stuck sometimes because people get stuck sometimes. We get stubborn. Sometimes it will seem as if there is no possible path forward. We are, after all, human. There are times when people will leave your community because their way of doing things or their opinions are significantly at odds with those of the majority. And that's okay too. We can say goodbye to people with kindness and encouragement, with sincere hope that they find a path and companions that work well for them. However, I've come to the conclusion that we don't need to part ways quite as often as we sometimes do. I believe that if we can keep our minds and hearts open enough to understand the truth behind someone else's story, even if it's not ours, we can move beyond begrudging tolerance to heartfelt celebration of the varied and collective wisdoms we represent. We talk about being tolerant. I once was at a workshop and one of the leaders said, "I tolerate outhouses." We can do better than that, people. It's been said that sometimes the heart sees what is invisible to the eye. And I think that's what I'm talking about here. Personally, I don't see the Bible stories of my childhood in the same light I used to, but increasingly, I find myself coming back to them. There are days when I'm feeling down and the line from the psalm comes drifting into a corner of my brain, making me feel calmer and more grounded. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He refreshes my soul. There are days when the idea of speaking out for social justice feels daunting, but then I remember, whenever you did this for the least of these, you did it for me. Are there stories in any of the scriptures of the world, or the fairy tales we tell our children? Are they factual? Some, no, very clearly not, and some unlikely so. But when I've been able to stop worrying about that part of it, is it true or not, I've come to a deep and abiding appreciation for the essence of those stories. When I think back, I'm both amused and moved by the ways my thinking has shifted. That very certain young Linda would not have predicted that I would end up here. I'm grateful for the practices and attitudes that have helped change me. I have been changed because good people have asked good questions, because I've found the patience and the skill and the wisdom to listen to others. Curiosity, my friends, curiosity and kindness and openness. I think that's where our path forward lies. We're going to do our closing hymn now, 10